All right, let's bring in now Chief Political Correspondent for The Australian, Geoff Chambers. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me. Look, this is a big story, this Chris Bowen pushback to the Coalition's energy plan. You wrote about it on the front page of The Australian newspaper today, and it really opens up another division between the Coalition and the Albanese government ahead of the next election.
Hi, Sharri. It's clear as day, and Peter Dutton said at his press conference today that essentially Australia will not meet net zero emissions by 2050 without nuclear being in the mix. And just before I came on your show, I spoke to a senior Labor source who described the numbers put out by Chris Bowen today as a gross misrepresentation of the idea that the Coalition is putting forward. And that idea, which is backed by very big businesses, including BHP, is to remove barriers and remove prohibition that stops this country even entertaining or investing or looking at where nuclear technology is going around the world. You'll hear Chris Bowen today talk about the two existing SMRs. He says they're in China and Russia. But the work being done by Bill Gates in Wyoming and across the states, the work being done by the UK, this technology will come to scale at some point. And of course, it will take time for Australia to include nuclear in its mix. But at no point has Peter Dutton ever suggested that the Coalition would force taxpayers to fund the construction of 71 nuclear SMRs across the country. That is a complete misrepresentation. They're talking about private sector investment, and we've heard from the private sector, and they're absolutely open and willing this government to move away from that ideology. And what I've heard today, and it's hard to work this out definitively, is that nuclear zero emissions technology is gaining traction in the electorate. I've seen some polling which shows that people are open to nuclear, particularly when you're talking about climate change and reducing emissions. People are much more open to nuclear, and this thought of a Chernobyl type or Fukushima type of gigantic nuclear power plant being built in your backyard. I mean, this is all fear-mongering now. The technology is moving at pace, and the size and scale of that will be very different over the coming couple of decades. And
there would, of course, still be questions to be worked out about waste and where these reactors would be located. But Geoff Chambers, I just have to point out, you broke this story, or you wrote about this story on the front page of the paper today, and you're just breaking the news live on air that you spoke to Labor sources before you came on this program, and they're calling Chris Bowen's figures a gross misrepresentation. Is that right? Labor sources questioning Chris Bowen's figures.
Yeah, and that's right. And I've also seen polling which shows that sentiment on the ground is moving. And say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you mentioned the word nuclear, and people, weren't interested in it. But now we're talking about nuclear submarines, and we're looking at different types of technologies that would be more amenable, particularly as our coal-fired generators come out. You've got ready-made sites for this with connections into the grid. So I think that voter sentiment shifting. I think it's probably worrying Labor as we head closer to the 25 election.
Yeah, and it looks like it is going to be another area where there'll be a big political fight. Now, another big story today, the chief executive of Qatar Airways says the government's decision to block extra flights from their airline was very unfair. This all ahead of next week's Senate inquiry into Labor's controversial decision. The US recently, Geoff, also approved extra flights from the Middle Eastern airline, and yet Australia, Albanese under pressure over why, and they haven't been able to explain this, why they rejected those 28 extra flights in and out of the country.
Yeah, so Bridget McKenzie is chairing a Senate committee which will meet in Sydney tomorrow for its first public hearing. There's also hearings in Perth, Brisbane and Canberra over the next fortnight. My understanding is they're obviously have called Richard Goyder, the chair of Qantas, the current Qantas CEO, Vanessa Hudson, and also former CEO Alan Joyce, who is overseas. But they are confident that they will be able to bring Alan Joyce before the inquiry. They're also talking to senior Qatari officials about participating, and the Qatar Airways global CEO who, from the States over the weekend, described the decision as very unfair. I understand that he will likely take part in the inquiry as well.
Yeah, and Bridget McKenzie, who you mentioned, is chairing that Senate inquiry. She's on the show here every Wednesday, so she'll let us know how that's going. Now, Anthony Albanese is being urged to lobby Chinese President Xi Jinping not to invade Taiwan when he is expected to visit, when he does visit Beijing in November or December later this year. This is a story by Matthew Knott in the Sydney Morning Herald today. Geoff, do you think Albanese would raise Taiwan? This is such a critical issue for our entire region, but particularly for Australia, given we might be embroiled in such a conflict if it does eventuate. You know, it makes sense that Albanese would raise it with Xi. Do you think he will?
Look, I think this trip will, very much commemorate Gough Whitlam's 50th anniversary, marking his historic trip to China. We might see some words in relation to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, but I doubt that Taiwan will be a priority conversation when and if that meeting happens later this year. There's other things they will talk about, including those trade bans, some of those that are still ongoing, and some detained Australians over there. So, I read that story, and I'm sceptical of whether the Prime Minister makes Taiwan a main priority on his trip.
Yeah. Now, I do have a statement from DFAT in response to that story. DFAT has said that Australia values its deep and productive unofficial relationship with Taiwan, focused on trade and investment, cultural and people-to-people ties, and that Australia will continue to work with our partners to build a region that is peaceful, stable and prosperous. So that's what DFAT's telling us in response to that story. So no confirmation that Albanese will raise that issue at all or lobby China not to invade Taiwan. But I do understand that when the Prime Minister met with Premier Lee, Chinese Premier Lee, at their meeting in Jakarta in September, so earlier this month, he did raise the issues of the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. So at least there, he kind of put it on the table, but not so strong as lobbying. Now, Geoff, less than 4 weeks to go until the Voice referendum. How do you think the campaign is going so far? Clearly, the polls are indicating that the No campaign is firmly ahead. Do you think this will shift over the next 4 weeks? I mean, we saw a lot of activity from the Yes side on the weekend, big rallies and concerts. Reports that 200,000 people turned out to those rallies. So, do you think there is going to be some shifting of the undecideds into the Yes?
It was their biggest show of force for the Yes 23 campaign over the weekend. And Yes 23 is very hopeful that in this final 4-week period that undecided voters and soft voters will swing back. But they acknowledge that they are behind. And they're potentially behind not only in terms of majority of states, but also the popular vote. And I think I did a story on Saturday looking at the fact that the No campaign has signed up 15,000 volunteers and that the Liberal and national organisations and divisions are now actively encouraging grassroots members to get out there and support the No campaign, because right now Yes 23 has about 40,000 volunteers and they're looking at potentially 70,000. And at 70,000, they'll be able to man pretty much every booth in the country where it matters. So, look, it's going to be an interesting few weeks. Yes, 23 desperately needs to swing back some of those undecided and soft voters.
I mean, it's all anyone is talking about at the moment. But ultimately, for the referendum to succeed, I mean, it's a very high hurdle. So it's a national majority and a majority of states have to vote yes as well. So this is a very tough ask, even if the proposal wasn't as unpopular as it seems to be according to the polls.
Yeah, that's right, Sharri. And I think that the Yes team who launched a new ad over the weekend, you're going to see lots of spending on ads over the coming few weeks. And they're hoping that now all the ugliness of Parliament and question time and the rest of it's done, that they can get back out there. But they've also got to balance cost of living pressures and other things that still are priorities for households. But yes, at some point in the next few weeks, households will start to think of which way they'll vote, and it will come down to who can be convinced.
Yeah. All right, Geoff Chambers, thank you so much for your time.